Good morning. I'm Lisa Wainwright, the Dean of Faculty at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, the co-host of Dialogue. We had a wonderful time last year offering an academic program along with the stunning presentation behind us. So looking at art, talking about art, maybe a little champagne, it's a perfect day. And we begin with one of my dearest and most important faculty members, William O'Brien, who is also an alum of the School of the Art Institute and teaches at the school in the ceramics department, although his media production is wild and promiscuous and rich and wonderful, and he'll probably talk about that. It's not just ceramics, it's many, many things. And he is being interviewed today by Christopher Vroom, great supporter of the arts. Thank you, thank you. Artadia, Art Space. He is one of those important figures behind the scenes who is making it possible for artists to succeed in a challenging environment. And so welcome. It's going to be a terrific day and tomorrow of conversations. I hope you can stay around. Michelle Grabner from the school is being interviewed at noon in a panel, and many other key players in the world of art and design. So welcome, and gentlemen.
Didn't know I could get out of that chair. So thank you, Lisa, for that great introduction and for doing all you do to support culture here in Chicago and around the world. The school is an amazing resource. So as Lisa said, I'm Chris Vroom. I'm the founder of Arcadia. Bill O'Brien is an artist that I was fortunate enough to meet through the Arcadia Awards process here in Chicago in 2006. I'm going to go through a little bit about what we do at Arcadia, and then we're going to have a conversation about Bill and his work, which I agree is amazing, and then we'll open up for questions. So Arcadia was started about 15 years ago, and since then we have awarded over $3 million to artists living and working in communities around the country. We operate in San Francisco, where we started. Chicago was our second city. We then expanded to Houston, Boston, Atlanta, and now are in the midst of our inaugural award process in Los Angeles. Over the last 14 or so years, roughly 15,000 artists have applied for our awards, underscoring what a great need there is for support to artists. So, and why do we do this? So we do this because we believe that artists are situated at the foundation of this entire cultural ecosystem from which we derive so much benefit. So artists not only give us their visions of the world, reflections of issues of the day, political and otherwise, they reach into themselves and give us this viewpoint that is diverse and amazing and wonderful, and sparks an intellectual journey that is really gratifying, life enriching. Artists also, in many cases, play additional roles beyond their artistic production. So we appreciate the objects that adorn the walls of homes and fairs and museums and so on. But artists are oftentimes, and Bill is a case in point, educators and mentors. They're civically active, so they play a role in society that I think is multifaceted and really needs to be supported. Also, the arts generally is a huge contributor to the economy. And I've always found this statistic in the back very illuminating and arguing for more support for the arts. The $160 billion is the economic activity generated by arts-related nonprofits in the United States. $20 billion is arts-related philanthropy. So the return on that philanthropy is about 8 to 1. So if you want to look at it along that vector, it makes a pretty good point for being engaged and involved in supporting artists. Starving artists. So I think about this term a lot, and it's a peculiar term in my opinion, because the whole notion of the starving artist is that there is that they kind of deserve it, like artists should be starving because their work hasn't been recognized by the market, and if the market doesn't recognize them, it's not good enough. And this is an extremely unsophisticated perspective. It belies the fact that artists are oftentimes not always recognized right at that point in time for their future vision. And it also doesn't lend any credit to the other roles that artists play in our society that I mentioned before. And I often reflect upon how generous artists are in talking about their work and letting us into their studios and explaining this very personal process. It's quite a courageous thing to do. And I reflect upon that, and I ask myself, if you went up to a litigator or some other professional and said, I just want to learn about the law. I'd like to come over to your office for an hour, and I'd like to have you take me through what you do and what the law is all about. They would be like, what? You're crazy. So I think that we need to think about artists in the totality of what they contribute, and by so doing, I think we can change the dialogue and prompt more support for what they're up to. So I want to just spend a couple minutes talking about the Artadia process, and then we'll start the dialogue with Bill. And I'm going to reference the 2006 award cycle in Chicago, where Bill was recognized. That year we had about 500 artists apply from the city, all living in Cook County. We then conduct a two-step review process. So we go through about 4,000 slides and then 15 studio visits. We engage a range of nationally recognized curators and artists, because one of the benefits we think we can provide to artists is forging relationships and helping make connections across the country. So up on your upper left is Gilbert Vicario, who at the time was the curator of Latin American art at the MFA Houston. William Stover, who was a curator at the MFA Boston, the artist Rob Lazzarini, Lydia Yee, who at the time was at the Bronx Museum, now at the Barbican, and then our own Stephanie Smith from the Smart Museum. So we brought these professionals together and conducted the review of the slides. So every single artist who applied got a chance to expose their work to this group of professionals. And as I've just alluded to, they move around. So it creates additional opportunities for exhibitions and new relationships. We then selected a short list after 15 studio visits with the artists. And then, the awards were given, 10 awards, and in that year, the two top awards went to Nick Cave and William O'Brien. And so I'm going to pause here because I will never, ever forget ascending the staircase to your domain and being absolutely amazed at the range of artistic practice and the care with which you approach the work. And I thought, I might just begin by asking what that was like for you when we did that in November 2006.
At that time, I had just finished my MFA at the Art Institute, which was, to be frank, a very depressing transition out of grad school into actually trying to figure out how to exist in the world, but then also actually genuinely devote time to studio practice. So the studio that Artadia actually came to visit was, I didn't really have a studio. I was like living in an attic. When my studio was in an attic, and I actually didn't have any walls. So the work I was making at that time was really based on the fact that I didn't have walls. So I was doing a lot of these fabric pieces. I think like every artist in general just sort of struggles with this idea of like, how do I maybe devote and sort of mitigate this idea of like a being myself and being genuine and embracing these ideas of freedom and autonomy in the studio, But then also sort of like realizing, obviously, there is this commodification that happens that is necessary to actually fund your practice, right? And so before the Artadia, I was really sort of struggling with this idea of like knowing that I, wanted to support my practice, but there was just obviously this reality of how do you transition from making work in school and then also to either working in a commercial gallery or teaching in academia or being able to keep up your practice. And so I remember when you came to my studio, it was a complete disaster. And and maybe you're thinking it's interesting, but to me it was like poverty isn't glamorous. It was more embarrassing.
Okay.
And so it was more after that, I was sort of like, I was really embarrassed actually, because I was like, this is such a joke. Like, I am, like, God only knows what these curators think of my work. Like, I can't even get it together to actually present something cohesive. But I also was it was almost this interesting transitional point where, on one hand, I was still very much could care less about the idea of forming some kind of audience to sort of commodify my work, but then also one thing that I really felt was really important during that time was that most of my practice was very experimental, and it sort of was. It was nice to have this idea to know that in place of this idea of really being genuine in your artist practice, that's a path that you can follow. Like, you do not have to, despite the ways that maybe this fair is like constructed and like presented maybe a certain way of looking at art, you can still exist and have an autonomy in your studio practice where it's not necessarily reliant on external factors. That it's not just like a powerlessness that exists as an artist in the studio, but that you actually can have more empowerment in that process, in terms of how to survive and make work. There's not just one way of doing it.
Did you find in the questions from the curators?
This is like how many years ago? I'm like
7 years ago. Okay.
Remind me, please. I mean, I'm not trying, but I'm
let me ask it in a slightly different way.
No, I'm just like, because I'm just kidding.
What, do you remember being nervous or?
Of course. Yeah.
So you're people from all over the country.
Yeah, I mean, this idea of like, you're like, okay, like, I mean, I remember that studio visit. I mean, I really remember I was like, well, that was fun, not getting the Artadia grant. It wasn't like I left that studio visit feeling like, I've got this. Like, it wasn't it was very much like a conversation and as you were sort of alluding to earlier in your discussions, that with artists, it's this thing where it's a very personal thing to bring people into your neurosis and psychology and maybe, into your world. And so having strangers in your home is awkward, right? It's like, how do you negotiate those kind of conversations? But that's actually why people like art.
Right, of course. So talk a little bit about the aftermath. You get the award, what?
Well, yeah, I mean, I feel like I won the lottery. It was just like this idea of like, wow, like, I mean, kind of, yes, at that time it was a really significant thing, as a way of sort of encouraging me and giving me confidence that the way I was doing things in my way was good. It was sort of encouraging that there is no one way to exist in this role as an artist. It's very personal, and most of the time, as artists, we sort of we don't end up doing this thing because of necessarily, let's say, positive attributes of ourselves. A lot of times it's like maybe a neurosis or sort of like whatever. So it's like the idea that you could be encouraged to pursue that is very personal. It's very I think, a significant transition for me. and giving me the confidence to know that maybe at that time there were not parts of my practice that could easily transition to be commodifiable, but that was actually the value of the work. That the work is not actually easily understandable in that way. And that's actually a good thing. And so the importance of having this sort of like externalized organizations is it encourages that in a good way. You know, as a way of like not, sorry, but no.
Yeah. And then, you know, the aftermath of getting the award, you started working with Shane Campbell.
Yes.
One of your pieces was included in a great show at Barbara Gladstone.
Yes.
Remember that? I actually have.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, right?
Oh, yes.
So this was great. This was on the New York Times, the front cover of the New York Times art section, and it was a ceramic show, and, you know, singled out your work as, you know, really a true standout in the whole show.
Yes.
You know, for this, you know, this piece here, which is amazing and was bought by a major collector in New York.
Yes. This piece also, too, I think, kind of represented this sort of a transition into. At the time before I was making this work, a lot of my work was installation-based, and so this piece was like an interesting transition into maybe more sculptural objects, and the way that maybe the things that were existing that I was attracted to at that time that had to do with collaging, spontaneity, and performance in the studio, and sort of not maybe wanting to establish or had at the time had an interest in placing the work historically. This is the piece that actually sort of happened as a transition into. But you know, when I was making this piece, it was like, and I was sending it to the show. A big part of this was really this awkwardness also that exists in terms of how artists, you know, try to figure out how to be business-like, right? It's like a couple of days ago I was having this conversation with someone that I think we can be in a time where the artist is completely trashed and is like non-functional and is like can't get it together, and there's this idea of the artist being like misfit, and so, but we're in a time of artists have to be professional. It's a business, you know. It's like they have to be able to pack their work, ship it, like, you know, get it together. So this also, I think, kind of represented a transition into that kind of, for me, figuring out and establishing what was comfortable in terms of how to have the work transition from the private space of the studio into more of a public way of, like,
Yeah, it's recognition at a different level.
Yeah,
for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you construct a piece like this, this type of installation,
yes,
do you make the individual works specifically for the installation, or are you assembling existing pieces and determining how they should be juxtaposed?
I think it's really depends. I think that my work comes very strongly out of this idea of gesture, physical expression, directness. The one thing that I was actually talking about a lot this week with my students was this idea of listening and subtle listening. A lot of times this idea of listening is like a part of process with artists, how each artist actually determines and evaluates when to start or stop a piece is very much related to this idea of subtle listening. And I'm attracted to and playing around with starting points and end points with the making of the work. I very much am attracted to physically being in the studio making the work, but then also this idea where that drawing can actually manifest itself not only in a two-dimensional realm, that drawing can actually exist in 3 dimensions, that it can sort of coexist as it relates to performance. So a lot of times when I think about making these pieces, I might have an idea of the architectural size of the space, and that kind of might influence the structure of how the work is presented. But many times I like the idea of being surprised, because otherwise it becomes very boring. You know, it's like you kind of need some sort of element of non-control to make it interesting, for me at least.
That whole, I mean, I was reading the essay that accompanied your show at the Renaissance Society in 2011 by Hamza.
Yes.
Who's a very, very good writer.
Yes,
very
I'm like going through the whole essay right now. I'm like, what did it say?
Very dense. Well, he references that.
I'm like, it's just like, okay, I'm ready for this.
Yeah,
like, what
exactly.
question is this going to be?
Freud. Talk about your childhood. You know, he talks about this notion of loss of control and how that expresses itself in the work.
Right. Well, that actually essentially comes from a sense of discipline. I think discipline has to exist in the studio practice for experimentation and spontaneity to come out of that. I think you can't exist maybe as an artist that just thrives off of experimentation. A lot of times those people are called, and I can be maybe this a tornado artist, where you're kind of just like, you know, bricolage and like this idea of found materials come out of that. But then also too, though, I think that discipline essentially, for me, is the ground point of experimentation. I need to produce consistently in order to actually feel confident to experiment. Otherwise, I think what happens a lot of times is neurosis will take over, and it's hard to sort of determine maybe effectively how to gauge where things are at. But this is how I approach working. I mean, it's sort of... is that a good answer?
Yeah, absolutely.
The longer this interview goes on, the more this neurosis is
becoming
going to start
increasingly
coming
articulate.
out.
I think it's great.
It's going to start coming out more. I'm like,
Articulate.
don't talk about your personal life. Don't talk about
Right,
your
right.
Just like keep it to the art. Keep it to the art. Just like don't. I didn't even tell the like story. There's this story about the. I'm not going to tell it. But just
Tell a story. Tell a Halloween story.
when you guys were visiting the studio, I had this neighbor who was like a public like masturbator, and like he I was really self-conscious of this because he was like an exhibitionist and he was like right across from my window. And so when the Artadia people came over, I was like, please let him not be masturbating. So that's the more interesting thing about my studio visit than my work. Like I was like kind of like, God, I really hope he's not going to be there today because I want them to look at my art and I want them to look at the masturbator. But I don't know if you remember that or not, but because afterwards I was like, great, like the masturbator was there, and like I remember going to the Artadia cocktail reception. I was like, man, I like fucked up. All right, sorry. We're gonna make this more interesting.
That happened in 2003. So talk about the different mediums that you work in, because there's quite a range.
Yes. Well, I think it's important to have flexibility in the studio. I think some artists need a certain level of discipline and sort of need to sort of stick with something to have one way of working. I think it's really good to have flexibility in the studio in terms of experimentation, right? Like if something is made in such a linear fashion, I think it can be very limiting for the maker. So for me, I really need to have a wide range of materials present. I also think I'm attracted to tactility. And also this relates to this idea of listening that I've been thinking a lot about, subtle listening, right? So if you're subtle listening in terms of this idea of taste and aesthetics, that really mitigates the way that things are, the things you're attracted to and what you make, right? Because that changes every day, it doesn't, I think that this is one of those life things, right? It's like you have to determine whether you need to force yourself to get up in the morning to go to the studio or you need to sleep in. This is subtle listening, but it also relates to this criteria of what needs to be made right now, right? What is appropriate. And I think material choice comes into that for me in the sense of, some days I need to be more forthright. Some days the material needs to be the process needs to be more established on an idea of working with the grid. It needs to be tighter. Sometimes it needs to be nonlinear, right? And some materials, ceramics in particular, I think is a really good material for fluid manipulation, right? It's really natural, it kind of, if you use ceramics and clay how it's meant to be used, it's very playful, but then clay also has a very rigidity to it. It can be very structural, but in order to make something that's very linear or structural out of clay, you have to listen. You know, you can't make it in one day. It takes a couple of days. So I'm really attracted to that. And when I was in grad school, my grad advisors were like, "You have focusing issues. Like you can't focus on one thing." And I was kind of like, "No, I don't think you know what you're talking about." But I was kind of like, I was more kind of like, "No, I need to experiment. You know, you need to fail and make bad work." This is more like relates to material choice. Is like subtle listening comes out of this idea of making something out of metal is going to be much different than making something out of paper, right? And I really like that. I like the idea of what things can do.
Absolutely. So after...
Am I talking too much?
No, not at all. Not at all. I think it's great. After this piece was shown, you then went on and associated with the wonderful Marianne Boesky gallery, and now you recently became part of the On Rec program, right?
Yes.
In Paris and Brussels, which is great. Great gallery. What's it like going from being in that emerging, for an artist being at an emerging state to being at a level where you have broader recognition, you're doing museum shows all over the place. How do you navigate that?
With a lot of neurosis and insecurity. I think that I sort of mention this to my students sometimes. I'm like, oh, just so you know, all those things that you have right now, those insecurities and neurosis, you only get amplified more once you do bigger things, right? I think that your question in terms of navigate that, in terms of time management?
Yeah, just to the extent there are artists out in the audience listening to say, because you've gone on this trajectory, which has been, really positive trajectory.
Right, there's also very negative things that come out of that as well. Yeah. Right? Like, there's, someone told me yesterday, they were like, yeah, I thought you were really simple, but you're actually really complicated. And I was like, so now I'm sitting here being like, I don't think I'm that complicated. But I think this idea of anything in life, right, is the more that you do something, there is a certain level of comfort that exists and hopefully some level of confidence. But then there's also a lot of sort of like, this industry of art making, it's like, there are no guarantees, right? So you have to sort of, there's, a certain level of like being in the trenches. I think that's really important for me to actually still be humbled in my work, and also, but then also recognize, I'm a human being and I have physical capacities, and that you sort of have to choose what's appropriate at that time. You can't please everybody.
Right, that's absolutely right.
But also, too, in terms of transition, I think that the good, I said this to someone the other day, I said, I'm very lucky, right, that I actually can, pursue bigger projects, because of these opportunities. And that's a very good thing.
Absolutely. Let's talk, this is the floor. Sorry, I'm coming back. Do you want to talk? I've got examples of your sculptural work over time you want to talk about. Sure. Like this piece is from 2008. 13 by 7 by 16.
Well, how many slides do we have here? Just
75.
Okay.
Yeah, we've got about 8 slides. Eight slides of work, and I can go.
This piece actually came out of when I first started doing ceramics. I had come out of grad school really being a little damaged, okay, in terms of how I viewed art. Like, I felt very self-conscious in terms of being like always very aware of everything and self-critical. So I ended up taking a ceramics class at Lil Street and told no one I was an artist, as a way of kind of not taking myself so seriously. And so a lot of the ceramic work kind of came out of this extension of real experimentation. And so some of these earlier pieces, I think, were both this idea of maybe embracing naivete as a positive thing. I remember at the time when I was making a lot of this work at Low Street, people would come up to me and kind of pull me aside and they'd be like, do you need help? Like, do you need help? Do you want me to help you? Because you really seem like you do not know what you're doing here. And I would just sort of say, oh, I kind of know, but that sort of awkwardness of experimentation in a good way. You know, it's good to sort of have an idea of being able to do something that you challenge yourself. So a lot of the early ceramic work kind of came out of this need for experimentation, and I think the body is in there more, body of the artist, process, also fluids and psychological.
So this is pretty typical of your scale from this time. You've got some much more significant, larger pieces, and not just more significant, but larger scale pieces at Marianne's booth.
Yeah,
right
someone
here.
told me you should never make any art that you can't physically carry yourself.
You can carry those?
No,
right.
I can't. So that's.
So you violated. When you make a piece like this, do you have an idea of, what the final form is going to be, or is it more improvisation?
Depends on the day.
Yeah.
Depends. This work, obviously, I think is more of a direct way of working.
Mm-hmm.
I think the figurative work is more. It depends on the criteria. How did the beginning of the making of the work.
Let's move forward. It was 2011.
Yeah.
So you start to expand the materials that are in the ceramic work.
Yeah.
Here's an installation view from Marianne's from made between 2008 and 2011. This is from 2012. Also from 2012. So this
sort of represents too, like this tension though between materials, right? And this is something that I've been considering, thinking about a lot. Is like a lot of things that people talk about with my work is this quality of tactility. There's a certain level of physical tactility there, but metal is very challenging to make tactile. But then I also I like the contradictions that can exist within the practice. That it's not easy to sort of say, oh, I know what Bill makes.
Right.
It's like, oh, he makes this and this.
Was this one of the first pieces that you did in metal?
No.
No.
It was the last year. It was probably the second series.
Second series.
Yeah. It looks a little crooked. Piece is about to fall over, huh? I like seeing, I was like, is that a liability there or something? I swear it's not that, These pieces are made actually a lot of times. I will cut a lot of cardboard and make a lot of mock-ups and life-size mock-ups. And that's really good in the sense that it offers the ability to translate a little bit more my hand into the metal beforehand. This might be hard to believe, but metal is actually rather challenging to cut. It's not a casual thing to do.
Yeah.
So these pieces came more from experimenting with translating the material. Looks kind of like a coat rack, doesn't it? A little bit like umbrella, this in there or something.
Or a TV antenna.
TV, yes. TV.
Here's some works on paper.
Yes, color pencil drawings. Mm-hmm.
And so do you work simultaneously on the sculptures and the drawings?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And is there a relationship between the two or no?
Do you think there is?
What do you think about this? I personally think that they're independent bodies.
Really? That's interesting. Why? I can tell you, but no, that's interesting. Do you think they're different?
Well, I mean, these in particular, there are other works on paper that have more of a kind of a free form improvisation.
Sometimes I find myself making a lot of these when I need to deal with problems in my personal relationships, because I spend a lot of time sitting making these, and they're kind of like quilting a little bit. I do a lot of underdrawing first, and then I'll go over with overdrawing. And the underdrawing doesn't always necessarily translate to the overdrawing in the way that the composition will happen. I look at these as very much, some people would say that my emotive, more emotional work is very psychological, but I actually view the color pencil drawings as, for me, the most psychological in terms of the meaning that's in there.
Right, because of the process.
Yeah, but I think that I've come to more embrace the contradictions between things than needing to necessarily make those connections. Actually, Catherine Hickson was my grad advisor at the Art Institute, and I remember she said, I was talking about this issue of really struggling to feel like I needed to make sense of everything, and she sort of said, you know, those contradictions are the value of the work. And so I've kind of tried to remember that a little bit, that that's a good thing. You know, I think composition and sound is a big part of the work. A lot of times, you know, there is always this tension with every artist between when the work is being made and then actually when it's viewed. Right, so how I look at this piece and the other viewer looks at this piece, I think is very different. I was having a conversation with someone a month ago about this question of beauty and decoration. I think some of the work kind of pushes those buttons a little bit, you know, between the decorative and the kind of non-decorative.
Well, I mean, particularly when it's hard to discern the emotional tie that goes into making the work.
Yeah, yeah. I worked as a designer in New York in advertising before I became an artist, and I think I do, I really like the grid, but I'm a really messy person, so as much as I want to be a minimalist, it's just not going to happen.
Right.
So it's just like, but I really like the grid, you know.
That's it.
Oh.
Well, let's open it up for questions, though, if anyone has any questions. Interrogation room. Yeah.
So, you talked more about talking about listening as several different kinds of listening.
Yes.
Okay, so listening to the voices in your head, which versus the unproductive or productive. Then listening, when you talked about instructional takes, listening to perhaps part of a larger cultural conversation that's still happening in the hall down here, and then listening to the phenomenon. So, perhaps the most interesting, which is about the present and sort of deciding about material, that it's not exactly a rational, cognitive decision, it's something to do with your space. So those are three really different kinds.
Yeah, no, there's different kinds of listening, I mean, I was sort of talking about this with someone when we first hear, when someone says, I need you to listen to me. Most of the time you're like, oh, I'm so tired. you're like, I'm listening here, and you're like, I don't listen. You know, that's one very cliche, right? Like, please listen to me, and that's very limited, right? But then, I think more this relates to this idea of curiosity, as you were sort of alluding to, that maybe that letting go to the constructs of what you really see, or this idea of you can listen with your eyes, and that sort of I think lightens the responsibility sometimes of the practice. that it doesn't have to always be about a limited way of looking at something, but then also, as most of us struggle with as makers, is how do we determine when something is good or not, right? What is the criteria for that? Like, how do we establish something that is actually beautiful or ugly, done, in progress? And I'm only curious about this because a lot of people will tell me, like, the work that I actually don't think is done, or I don't think is very good, has the best reception. So this relates to my own thinking in terms of, like, what I think is done versus what is actually maybe interesting work. But then also, I don't think a lot of us listen. I think we're very speedy all the time, right? It's like you gotta get here, walk through the carnival to get to Navy Pier, you know, I gotta go, I gotta get there by 11, you know, it's like, right? So it's like no one really, it's the idea of pausing more, let's just say that. Because that, I think, is more related to, you know, for me, as a maker, you know, making it more interesting. Is that kind of? Yes. Thank you for that question.
Anyone else?
You only knew how much these lights were glaring. Anyone else?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes, Anthony.
How does this idea of like exploiting, I guess, neuroses in your work and prominence have to play into not only like your studio practice, but into, I guess, more specifically like judgment on the music or like pending starting points? I've just seen how.
Well, I think about this idea a lot of, like, you know, I don't know if this is true, you know, de Kooning went through this period where he could not determine the endpoint of his work, so he had to have people come into the studio and literally be like, stop it, I'm taking it now. You know, and that's maybe related to a little bit of that, but then also, I think for me, I actually sometimes need to establish solid rule following as a way to counterbalance that a little bit, as a way of determining that something is done. But this is why I'm actually really always very admirable of painters, because painters kind of rest in the space of being very comfortable in the gray area. You know, it's like that idea of beginning and end is very natural. But for me, I think drawing, I think people who are attracted to drawing is about following, you know, setting like a thing for that. But in terms of affect, or you mean like just establishing how to get outside of yourself and the work or something?
Yeah, that and I guess what's your criteria for the affect or the use?
I have, unfortunately, a lot of suffering and other things happening that I don't have, that doesn't come to me. So, believe it or not, it just happens, you know, and then I'm like, well, better go to the studio, work this out, you know. Hopefully I'll feel better in a couple hours, you know. Anybody else? Because, you know, this is an artist, someone says, you know, the artist talk is like a death, you know, it's like a small death, you know, so you schedule these things, you know, strategically. Anybody? Yes?
Can you be specific about some of the rules that you're setting for yourself?
Well, that's why it's secret. It's like ritual, right? You tell the ingredients in your recipe. Those Neiman Marcus cookies, right? Sometimes it's very pragmatic, where I will say, I have this much material and I need to use it all. Or lately it's been about a body, a series of work. So that is a challenge to sort of set, like, okay, I'm going to make these series, and I have to, it is done when this number is made. And other times it's time, right? Because most artists have to really micromanage their time in the studio. So if you tell yourself, I only have 3 minutes to make something, it will set up a certain level of constraints there in terms of your home. I just, can I say something? I'm sorry.
Sure.
I just want to say thank everybody for coming today. I didn't get to do that at the beginning. Thank you to the Expo, to Chris, Artadia. Are we done?
We're done.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I just want to say thank you to everyone who came, School of the Art Institute, Marianne Boesky Gallery, Shane Campbell Gallery, Almeen Radcliffe, everyone who's come to Chicago to support this fair. Yesterday was my father's birthday, so I'm wishing him a happy birthday as well here. I really appreciate the support. And, people always ask me, like, why I'm in Chicago. And I really feel like, well, Chicago is actually a place where a lot of real working artists are. It's actually, and I value that. So the community is very important. So thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. So.